different student groups, in particular Students for Justice in Palestine. They're a national student group. They've got chapters around the country. They've talked about using any means necessary to achieve their agenda, including armed rebellion. So I think we need to take these folks very seriously. We saw some significant events around the country last. We saw what I believe to be an awful lot of anemic and timid responses by presidents. And I'm fearful that come this fall, we're going to see a repeat of that, because we've heard a lot of presidents talking this summer about doing a lot of listening and a lot of training and revising and review of their policy. But in reality, every university around this country has a student protest policy. And every one of those policies lays out what would amount to a peaceful protest and how to protest and the manner in which to protest. And a lot of what we saw last spring was about peaceful protests, and we need to see presidents step up this fall and address this conduct in order to ensure a safe and secure teaching and learning environment.
You talked about a safe environment for all students. You'll recall it was anything but that. Let me bring up Columbia University, for example, where we saw Jewish students going through a gauntlet of people antagonizing them and condemning them for being Jewish. They couldn't even go to their classes at Columbia for fear of their own. They had some fracases with the various people there who were protesting against them. And so many of the Jewish students had to stay off campus to get their education. What is it? Why is this group so much against Jewish students? And why do we see this rise in anti-Semitism?
Yeah, look, I really can't speak to their motivations other than, we take them at their word. They are anti-Israel. They're anti-Israeli policies, both governmental and corporate policies. They're demanding divestment by their institutions in Israeli company that does business with Israel. And they've used a variety of different methods to try to get their point across. We saw them take over a number of campuses with illegal encampments. We saw them occupy buildings, damage college property, restrict access to students on campus or passing through campus. We saw students harassed, threatened, and intimidated. And we're fearful that this is going to continue this fall. And it's very important that administrators and presidents of these institutions recognize their responsibility to make safe and secure campuses and prioritize that over the demands of the mob. Because what we saw last spring was really an elevation and a prioritization of the mob over the vast rights of students. And may have gained those presidents some temporary secession and hostilities. But frankly, it undermined the teaching and learning process. It severely jeopardized safety and security for students, faculty, and staff on campus. And I believe it's going to incentivize more mob action come fall.
And to add what you're pointing to and what you're talking about, it's stated here, with the new academic year upon us and the likelihood of further disruptive protests this fall, college and university presidents must either step up to preserve the teaching and learning environment or step aside. Is that what you're telling college presidents?
Oh, absolutely. I think I strongly advocated that presidents need to be issuing a clear and unmistakable message to their college communities. The principal priority of this institution is the safe and secure teaching and learning environment. And any conduct by students or otherwise that interferes with our ability to achieve that goal will not be tolerated. I think colleges, that's a real critical concern this fall. And again, I'm hoping presidents have positioned themselves much more effectively to address these issues when the semesters begin.
And can you recall that last year, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, even visited. He was respectful of them, but went on to say that this college should not endorse this kind of behavior on college campuses. Look, we saw last year that several of these college professors had to testify before members of Congress, and many of them were, as a result of this, stepped down. But it seems like the problem is only getting worse
That seems to be a large question a lot of people are asking. Where are the funds coming for these individuals to continue these protests? Where is the financing coming from for the supplies and the tents and everything else that goes into these protests? I think a little less about that, but I'm much more concerned and focused on the institutional response. I want to be clear, I'm not looking to muzzle students simply because they may espouse a hurtful, offensive, or a hateful message. In fact, the First Amendment protects students' rights to do that. So a lot of what we heard on these campuses last spring were indeed hateful and hurtful and offensive to Jewish students, and indeed would have constituted and could have constituted anti-Semitic statements. But they're protected from uttering those. But again, what we saw last spring, was much more than just uttering statements. The conduct we saw, the interference with the educational process, the threats, intimidation, and harassment that students were subjected to, and everything else that we saw in the media that did not
Burning
fall
flags.
within the First Amendment needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with in a very strong manner. And including, we've got the benefit right now. I'm sorry.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but including the destruction of property that we saw at various colleges, UCLA, as well as Estes. Look, the bottom line, Ken, is that higher education, as we've seen from last year and now going into this year, is at a crossroads. This is a time where most colleges are celebrating college football. We are far from that if we continue to see the rise in protests. And to your point, everyone has a right to speak, no matter how hurtful and offensive it may be. But to actually go in and take over a college campus and prevent other students from going ahead to get their education, that is beyond the pale.
Absolutely. There's no protection under the First Amendment of conduct. And let me also add the right to statements that are offensive or hurtful or hateful. It doesn't mean that you're free of consequences for that speech. And we've seen this around the country where you have employers who have indicated that, look, we're simply not going to hire students coming out of those programs or coming out of those student organizations who've engaged in that level of protest because we just simply don't think that effectively the culture. And that's important. Again, that's a consequence. You can engage in free speech, but it's not free of consequences. And I think that's really important for the students to understand. But that only comes with accountability. And unfortunately, across the country, we've seen presidents that have just failed to hold accountable. I can, in contrast, at Emerson College in Boston, we had about 120 students arrested because they failed to heed multiple warnings and law enforcement to disband an illegal encampment. After the arrests, did the president hold those students accountable? Were there any consequences? No. In fact, the president sent his staff out that evening to post bail for the students who had been arrested. They canceled classes so that the community could heal over the event. He granted disciplinary amnesty to students and then pressured the local district not to press charges. So when you've got this type of action on your campus, and in essence, you act in a manner that will further incentivize, you can't be surprised when it shows back up come fall. Yeah. And that's what I'm fearful and concerned about.
Yeah, because what you're talking about there's no accountability, no responsibility. And it also goes to the core of what's happening within the staff and faculty, the professors of those colleges. Are some of these professors allowed to perhaps go so far as to incite some of these students to step into the anti-Israel and anti-American protests? And if that's the case, what is the responsibility of that college professor or that college president, I should say, in making sure there's some corrective measures taken against professors participating in this kind of behavior?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, particularly in higher ed, is faculty have, in addition to free speech rights at public college campuses, they also have this what's known as academic freedom that gives them a significant amount of latitude on instructional issues in the classroom and on their ability to comment on issues of the day. But that it's important to recognize too, though, that at many college campuses, and I would dare say through higher education, it really has become an echo chamber in that most faculty, most administrators, most presidents all share the same political and ideological viewpoints. So there is very little ideological diversity on our campuses. And to be honest with you, we spent the better part of the last 30 to 40 years talking about diversity in higher ed, and the focus during much of that time was on diversity. And I got to be honest, I think that for higher education, it would have been much more effective to focus less on what people look like and more on what they think. Because what we don't have in higher education is any intellectual diversity. And as a result of that, there is one message and one chant that we continue to hear. It's from one ideological spectrum. I believe that is a large contributing factor to what we're seeing occurring on our college campuses these days.
I'm talking to
I
Ken
got a
Tosh. We'll be
text
back with
message.
America's Hope in just a moment. The plight that we will likely witness this year, at least the start of this year, on our college campuses, and Ken, you and I were talking previously about American college campuses being at a crossroads, higher education, if you will, because of the protests that we witnessed last year against Israel and even against America, people waving the Palestinian flag and even the Hamas flag. And now we're seeing it start again with those particular students who were actively engaged in those protests, vowing that they will do the same thing again now. You're challenging the college presidents to step up and do the right thing. So what's motivating these college presidents to shy away from doing the right thing, and that is to bring peace for a good learning environment on their college campuses?
Sure. Again, I can't specifically
Sure,
speculate as to their own
ideology.
motivations. I can only take a few guesses. And I think there's probably one of three reasons why we've seen such weak, anemic, and timid responses at the presidential level across the country. First and foremost, I think presidents have lost sight of their role and responsibility as the chief operating officer of their institution. And to some extent, they sought to appease and compromise and negotiate with these students like a parent might with their child. I think we've seen another example where you've got institutional leaders that frankly share the anti-Israel sentiment testers, and they're finding it very difficult to separate their personal views and perspectives and reconcile those views with their duties and responsibilities as the head of their institution. And third, I think, and this may be most significantly, most of these presidents are rooted to the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. And I believe many of them were simply frozen in fear because they themselves were concerned that they would then be labeled an oppressor under the DEI dogma of the day. But you know what? In reality, whatever the reason, their failure to address these protests and their decision to elevate and prioritize the demands of protesters over the remainder of their students has done little but teaching and learning process, jeopardize safety and security, and again, as I said, incentivize more protests. Fortunate that that's the track they've taken. We've had other presidents around the country, say, for example, at the University of Texas at Austin or at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that were very clear in their message to their college community that the rules and regulations and procedures around peaceful protests and students were expected to comply with those rules, and if they failed to, there were going to be consequences. There was even a threat issued by faculty, I believe it was at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, that they were going to withhold until students who were suspended were reinstated. And I believe the provost there was very clear that we are not going to be held hostage by such a demand by faculty, and you have a responsibility not to withhold grades. And if you do, there will be disciplinary consequences. So, that's the kind of leadership I think at the institutional level, and it's just frankly been lacking at the national level.
Ken, one of the things that is very clear, abundantly clear, is that there's a lot of hate from being espoused from the protesters. There's a hate towards Jews, there's a hate towards Israel, and there's even a hate towards America. These are students who, have every right to voice their opinions. But I want to get into the ideology a little bit, and that's the fact that many of the protesters who have denounced Israel, denounced America, and have their concerns rightly placed on the fallout from the retribution that Israel has conducted in enacting its defense of its citizens based on what happened on October 7th. But many of these protesters have cited, while they cite the heartbreak and sadness that we see in Gaza because of the war, they have forgotten that the attack of October 7th, or maybe they didn't even pay attention to it, wasn't just really lobbied against Jews, but there was also Israeli citizens who are Christian, Muslim. Case in point, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, just recently rescued a man who was a hostage taken on October 7th by Hamas terrorists, and it turns out he's Muslim. Given that scenario, which is a reality of what took place on October 7th, that everyone representing more than 20 plus nations had been taken captive that day or even attacked that day on October 7th, everyone is represented there. So let's get into the ideology, the framework of why there's this rise in anti-Semitism when the victims on October 7th were clearly not just Jewish, they were also Christian and Muslim and Hindu and other faiths and other nationalities.
Yeah, look, I think, we've seen this rise in anti-Semitism or other aspects of hate. I think, again, personal views, I think much of it could lead to what we see around the diversity, equity, and inclusion model that's being in elementary, secondary, and higher education these days, where you categorize people in very big, broad categories as oppressor, without looking at, valuing, assessing, considering any of the nuances that are associated, with using those titles and the impact it has. I think that's a grave concern. I mean, I've talked before about in education at the elementary and secondary end. We've moved awful far away from what the focus and mission of education in our country used to be, which was to prepare young people to be good citizens, to be educated, to be critical thinkers. And we've really strayed far from that. And that's something I think, again, when many of these students get into higher education, they're in an echo chamber. They hear what they believe, and it's often not challenged. And it's never, they're never pressured to have to really justify or explain their views or positions. And I just think that becomes, again, the echo chamber for these individuals. I think anyone who has a view or perspective is an oppressor, and that is, I think, a lot of what's behind the ideology that we see today.
Ken, the other thing that I want to ask about, you talked about civility. Have we seen an attack on the soul of civility? And keep in mind that these people who are protesting and those who are trying to go to school just to get their education, they're all together, and they're the future leaders of America. So where do we find hope for restoring the soul of civility?
Again, I think this has a lot to do with the leadership on these campuses that prioritize the interests of the mob over the vast majority of your students. You're undermining the institution's ability to engage with students, to ensure the teaching and learning process is effective and ongoing. And what we've seen on many of these campuses now by these protesters is they have an absolute lack of concern or consideration for the impact of their protests. And it's not just on Jewish students. When you act in such a manner on a college campus and you overtake a building, an academic building, you're now depriving all students at that institution the opportunity to enter that building, to class, to learn, to be instructed, denying faculty the right to teach. You're engaging in conduct that is substantially and materially interfering with the core function of that institution. Protesters don't care. That's their intent. And that's unfortunate. And that's really where I believe presidents need to be a bulwark against this type of effort, this type of ideology on the behalf of the majority of their students, and not capitulate or seek to appease that very vocal minority.
Ken, I want to thank you for being on the program. It's always refreshing to have you on to share your insights and your expertise in this situation. You've been a college educator. You've been advising colleges for many, many years. Look, in the throes of all of this, there are many parents at home scratching their head saying, well, what's my son or daughter going to do at college? What will they encounter? Will they see these protests? And if I'm the parent of a Jewish student or the parent of a Muslim student or a Christian student, what's going to happen to them? Will they be persecuted for being someone who exercises their faith? All of this may dwindle down to people losing hope. We can't afford to do that in America. In the midst of all this going on, Ken, where do you see hope for America?
Well, look, I think you still have a circumstance where parents want the best for their son when you're considering higher education. And I think the circumstances that we saw last spring and we're again going to see this fall are going to give parents a new insight and hopefully make them much better consumers of where they're going to spend their education dollars. There are absolutely institutions of higher education throughout this country, both public and private, that respect the rights of individuals to express themselves, but that also respect the rights of the vast majority of their students to come to their institution to be taught and to learn. But at the end of the day, it's going to take the vast majority of our students to stand up and to push back, to regain control over their institutions, to again force institutions to focus on their principal mission, which is teaching and learning.